Millionaire belittled a waitress for being poor. Get out of here before your poverty contaminates me. 5 years later, he was paralyzed to find her in a luxury restaurant. Timothy Carter walked into the Rosewood, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, with the confidence of a man who had never heard the word no, dressed in an impeccable tailored suit, his wrist adorned with an absurdly expensive watch. He exuded arrogance with every step. The maitre d' greeted him with excessive enthusiasm, leading him to his usual table by the window. As he settled into his seat, Timothy scanned the room, barely acknowledging the waitstaff bustling around. To him, they were nothing more than background noise, faceless workers meant to serve. He didn't notice the exhausted expressions, the hurried movements, or the quiet desperation in their eyes. That was, until one particular waitress approached. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the clear fatigue in her posture. "Welcome to the Rosewood. My name is Chloe, and I'll be your server tonight. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Timothy didn't look up immediately. Instead, he focused on his phone, typing out a dismissive response to a business partner who had irritated him earlier that day. Only after a long pause did he lift his gaze. His eyes swept over Chloe, taking in her modest uniform, her slightly flushed face from rushing between tables, and the way she held her notepad just a little too tightly. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that annoyed him for reasons he didn't quite understand. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You again," he said, recognizing her from previous nights. "Are they running out of decent staff here?" Chloe's fingers curled slightly around the edge of her notepad, but she kept her expression neutral. "Would you like to start with a drink, sir?" Timothy leaned back, exuding the careless arrogance that had become second nature to him. "Let me guess. You're still working this dead-end job, haven't figured out how to get out of the gutter yet." A few nearby diners glanced over. Sensing the hostility in his tone, Chloe, however, remained composed. "I enjoy my work," she replied simply. Timothy chuckled, shaking his head. "That's adorable, you know. People like you are. Why places like this lose their exclusivity? You don't belong here." Chloe swallowed hard, her grip on the notepad tightening. She had dealt with rude customers before, entitled, dismissive, cruel, but Timothy Carter was something different. His words weren't just cutting, they were designed to remind her of her place. Still, she refused to let him see her crack. "If you'd like more time, I can come back." "Don't bother," Timothy interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. Then, with a sneer, he added, "And for the love of God, don't get too close. You reek of poverty." A quiet hush fell over the surrounding tables. A few waiters stopped mid-step, their eyes darting toward Chloe. Someone at a nearby table muttered, "Jesus, what an ass." Chloe felt her stomach churn. Heat rushed to her face, not just from humiliation, but from the sheer injustice of it. She wanted to throw her notepad at his smug face, wanted to demand why people like him thought they had the right to treat others as lesser, but she couldn't. Instead, she nodded stiffly, turned on her heel, and walked away. The moment she disappeared into the kitchen, the dam inside her broke. Her hands trembled as she gripped the counter, her breath shaky. Why do people like him exist? "Chloe." She turned to see her manager, Mr. Reynolds, approaching with an expression that made her stomach drop further. "Come with me to the office," he said. His voice strained. Chloe followed him, dread pooling in her chest. Once inside, Mr. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm going to be straight with you. Timothy Carter is a very important customer here. He's a major investor in some of our partner businesses, and he wants you gone." The words hit her like a slap. "You're firing me because of him." Mr. Reynolds avoided her gaze. "I can't afford to lose this restaurant over one waitress. I'm sorry." Chloe felt the air leave her lungs. She had given everything to this job. She worked late nights, took extra shifts, endured the exhaustion just so she could support her mother and brother. And now, because of one cruel man's ego, it was all gone. She clenched her fists. The humiliation, the injustice, the sheer unfairness of it all burned inside her like a wildfire. But beneath the pain, something else took root. Determination. She wouldn't let Timothy Carter be the reason she gave up. If he wanted to treat her like she was beneath him, then she would prove him wrong. That night, as she packed up her things and stepped into the cold air outside, she made a silent promise to herself. She would never, ever, let anyone make her feel small again. Chloe walked through the dimly lit streets, the cold air biting at her skin as she clutched her bag tightly against her chest. She had walked this route 100 times before, but tonight, everything felt different. She was no longer Chloe, the waitress at the Rosewood. She was Chloe, the unemployed girl who had just been humiliated in front of an entire restaurant. The words Timothy Carter had spat at her still echoed in her mind. "You reek of poverty," the way he said it, with that smirk on his face, like her existence was an inconvenience to him, like she wasn't even human. Her hands curled into fists inside her coat pockets. She had spent years working tirelessly, juggling long shifts to support her mother and pay for her brother Ethan's education. And yet, in a single moment, Timothy had managed to strip away her dignity with nothing more than a few cruel words. She reached her apartment building, an aging complex on the outskirts of the city. The hallway smelled of cheap detergent and old wood. But it was home, at least. For now, pushing open the door, she was greeted by the sight of her mother, Sarah, sitting on the couch with a worn blanket draped over her shoulders. "Hey, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice soft but tired. "How was work?" Chloe hesitated. Her mother had enough to worry about. Her worsening health, the endless medical bills, the fear of losing their home. The last thing she needed was more stress. So, Chloe forced a smile. "It was fine, Mom. Just another day." Sarah studied her daughter's face for a moment, her brows knitting together. Chloe knew her mother could always tell when something was wrong. "Are you sure?" Chloe nodded quickly, moving toward the kitchen to avoid the conversation. "I'm just tired. I think I'll head to bed early." As she poured herself a glass of water, she heard a door creak open. "Chloe?" She turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway of their small shared room. He was 17, still carrying the remnants of childhood in his face, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp for his age. He had grown up too fast. She did that to him, or rather, their circumstances did. "You're home early," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Did something happen?" Chloe swallowed hard. She wanted to tell him everything, that she had lost her job, that they might not be able to afford rent, that she had let him down, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she forced a casual shrug. "The restaurant was slow. They let me leave early." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "You should sleep," he said after a moment. "You work too much." Chloe laughed softly. "Somebody has to." Ethan rolled his eyes, but there was affection behind it. "Night, Chloe. Night, kid." Once he disappeared back into the room, Chloe exhaled slowly, the weight of the day pressing against her chest. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. She wanted to do something, anything, to release the storm brewing inside her. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out her now useless The Rosewood uniform, and threw it into the trash. Then, she made a promise. She would never let anyone make her feel that powerless again. The next morning, Chloe woke up with a plan. She didn't have the luxury of time to wallow in self-pity. She had bills to pay, a mother to take care of, and a brother with college dreams that depended on her. So, she got to work. First, she went to the diner across the street, Riley's, where she knew the owner was always looking for extra hands. But the moment she asked, the answer was the same. "Sorry, Chloe," Riley said, shaking his head. "Business is slow. I just don't have the hours to give you." Strike one. Next, she visited a small bakery she used to buy coffee from on her way to work. "Hiring?" she asked the woman behind the counter. "We just filled the last spot," the woman said apologetically. Strike two. Chloe refused to give up. She knocked on every door, applied to every opening she could find. Some places weren't hiring. Others didn't even bother looking at her application. By noon, her feet were aching. Her stomach was empty, and reality was beginning to set in. Finding a job wasn't going to be easy, but she refused to go home defeated. She made her way to an old sandwich shop near the city square, a place she had never been to before. It wasn't high-end like the Rosewood, but it had charm, wooden tables, the scent of fresh bread in the air, and a handwritten sign on the door that read, "Help Wanted." Chloe didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open and approached the counter. "Hi, I saw your sign. Are you still looking for help?" The man behind the register, a middle-aged guy with kind eyes, nodded. "Yeah, you got experience." "Yes," Chloe said immediately. "I worked as a waitress for years. I can handle a fast-paced environment. I'm great with customers and I'm willing to work extra hours." The man raised an eyebrow. "You sound desperate." Chloe was desperate. "I just really need this job," she admitted. The man studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right. Trial shift tomorrow. Be here at 6 a.m. Relief flooded through Chloe. "Thank you. You won't regret it." As she stepped outside, for the first time since last night, she let herself breathe. It wasn't much. It wasn't a luxury restaurant with expensive table settings and high-profile customers, but it was a start. And for Chloe, that was enough. Timothy Carter had always believed in his own invincibility. His life had been a steady climb to success. Each step meticulously planned, each deal carefully executed. He had never doubted that he would always be on top, until the cracks started to show. It started with whispers, small rumors in the business world that his company, Carter Enterprises, was hemorrhaging money. At first, he dismissed them as baseless gossip, the kind of nonsense jealous competitors spread when they couldn't keep up. But the whispers didn't stop. Then came the warning signs. Deals that once seemed effortless began falling through. Investors who had once begged to be part of his empire suddenly started pulling out. Board meetings grew tense, filled with hushed conversations and side glances whenever he entered the room. Timothy ignored it. He was Timothy Carter. He had built this company from the ground up. Whatever was happening, he would fix it. But then, the numbers started plummeting. He sat in his massive corner office, staring at the latest financial reports spread across his mahogany desk. The red numbers burned into his vision, mocking him. Millions gone. The losses were staggering, almost impossible to comprehend. His assistant, Jordan, stood stiffly near the door, shifting awkwardly. "Sir, the investors are asking for an emergency meeting. They're concerned about the—" "I don't give a damn what they're concerned about," Timothy snapped, rubbing his temples. "I need time to figure this out." "Time isn't something we have," Jordan said carefully. "Sir, Jeffrey requested to see you. He said it's urgent." Timothy's jaw tightened. His best friend and business partner, Jeffrey Collins, had been acting strangely lately. Distant, calculating, but if anyone could help fix this mess, it was Jeffrey. They had built this empire together. Send him in. Moments later, Jeffrey strode into the office, his signature smirk in place. His suit was crisp, his demeanor relaxed. Too relaxed. Considering the crisis unfolding. "Tim, my friend," he said smoothly, dropping into the chair across from him. "We need to talk." Timothy exhaled sharply. "What the hell is going on, Jeff? The numbers are tanking. Investors are panicking. What happened?" Jeffrey sighed, leaning back. "I've been trying to tell you for months. Tim, your spending is reckless. You've been too focused on your lifestyle and not on the company's future. The numbers don't lie." Timothy scoffed. "Bullshit. We were fine 6 months ago. This kind of loss doesn't happen overnight." Jeffrey tilted his head slightly, a knowing look in his eyes. "That's the thing, Tim. It didn't happen overnight." A cold weight settled in Timothy's stomach. Something about Jeffrey's tone sent alarm bells ringing in his head. "What are you saying?" Jeffrey let out a slow, deliberate sigh before reaching into his jacket and tossing a folder onto the desk. "You should take a look." Timothy hesitated before flipping it open. The blood drained from his face. Inside were documents, invoices, wire transfers, legal filings, all pointing to one undeniable fact. Jeffrey had been stealing from him. Millions siphoned off through shell companies. Fake expenses. Strategic investments that had somehow all ended up under Jeffrey's control. It was a perfectly orchestrated betrayal. Timothy's fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. "You," his voice came out low, dangerous. "You did this." Jeffrey didn't even flinch. "I protected myself. You were too busy playing king to see that the empire was already crumbling." Rage surged through Timothy. Hot and blinding, he shot up from his chair, his knuckles white. "You were my best friend." Jeffrey stood, adjusting his cufflinks like this was just another business deal. "And you were my greatest liability." The office door burst open before Timothy could lunge at him. Jordan stood there, pale and nervous. "Sir, the board has called an emergency meeting. They're demanding your resignation." Timothy's ears rang. The room tilted slightly. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was the betrayal. His company, his legacy, everything he had built. Gone. Jeffrey clapped a hand on his shoulder, a mockery of comfort. "I'd say I'm sorry, Tim, but we both know I'm not." And with that, he walked out, leaving Timothy standing in the ruins of his empire. By the time the meeting ended, it was official. Timothy Carter was no longer the CEO of Carter Enterprises. By the end of the week, his assets were frozen, his properties foreclosed. His luxury penthouse, gone. His cars, repossessed. For the first time in his life, Timothy Carter had nothing. He sat alone in a cheap motel room, the reality of his downfall settling over him like a crushing weight. He had spent his entire life believing that money was power, that his status made him untouchable. And now he was just another nobody. He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head at the cruel irony of it all. 9 years ago, he had ruined a young woman's life with a single sentence. "You reek of poverty." And now, he was poverty. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling butter filled the small cafe. Wrapping the early morning in warmth, Chloe wiped her hands on her apron and glanced around, watching as the first customers of the day filtered in. The soft hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware, and despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs, she felt alive. This was hers. 9 years ago, she had walked out of the Rosewood with her pride shattered, nothing but a heavy heart and a desperate need to survive. Now, standing behind the counter of Chloe's kitchen, she was no longer that girl. The cafe had started as a small dream, a whispered thought in the dead of night, when she had nothing but determination to keep her going. She had spent years saving, planning, sacrificing, working shifts no one else wanted, sleeping no more than 4 hours a night just to scrape enough money together to make this happen. And now, here it was, her reality. It wasn't a 5-star restaurant, nor did it have the polished marble floors and sparkling chandeliers of the Rosewood, but it had something far more important: heart. She poured a cup of coffee and placed it on the counter just as the front door swung open. "Morning, boss," Maggie called, kicking the door shut behind her. Chloe smirked. "You're late." Maggie grinned, setting her bag down. "You work me too hard. I needed an extra 10 minutes of sleep." "More like an extra 30, Chloe teased. Maggie only shrugged before grabbing a notepad and moving toward the first table of customers. Chloe watched her go with a small smile. She had lucked out with Maggie. They had met at the sandwich shop years ago, 2 overworked women trying to make ends meet when Chloe finally opened her cafe. Maggie had been the first person she hired. "Boss, we're out of croissants again," came a voice from the kitchen. Chloe sighed, rubbing her forehead. "Already? It's not even 8. We got slammed with orders this morning," the cook replied. It was a good problem to have, but still, it meant Chloe needed to adjust again. She grabbed her keys. "I'll run to the bakery down the street and get more." Maggie lifted a brow. "You sure? You barely sat down." "I'll survive," Chloe said with a tired smile. "Cover for me." She stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air. The city was already alive, people moving with purpose, the streets buzzing with energy. She loved this place. It had been cruel to her once, but now, she had carved out a space where she belonged. The bakery was only a few blocks away, a small family-owned business she had built a partnership with. She pushed the door open, the scent of fresh bread hitting her instantly. "Chloe?" The owner, Mrs. DeLuca, beamed at her. "Back so soon." "You know me," Chloe said with a laugh. "I underestimated the morning rush." Mrs. DeLuca chuckled, grabbing a paper bag. "Your usual order. Double it." The older woman whistled. "Business must be booming." "It's getting there," Chloe admitted. Feeling a swell of pride, she handed over the cash, thanked her, and rushed back to the cafe, balancing the warm bag in her arms. When she returned, Maggie was waiting by the counter, arms crossed. "While you were gone, someone stopped by asking about you." Chloe frowned, setting the bag down. "Who?" "Some guy in a suit. Said he was a real estate developer, interested in your place. Chloe stiffened. A developer? Maggie nodded. He left his card, said he wanted to discuss a possible buyout. Chloe picked up the business card and turned it over in her fingers. She had heard rumors of developers circling the area, snatching up small businesses to make way for luxury high-rises. She exhaled sharply, setting the card down. Not happening. Maggie grinned. Knew you'd say that. Chloe's kitchen wasn't just a cafe. It was her fight, her proof that she had rebuilt herself from nothing, and no amount of money would make her give that up. The bell above the door rang again, and she turned, expecting another regular. Instead, she saw Ethan, her younger brother, strolling in, textbooks under his arm. Shouldn't you be in class? She asked, arching a brow. He grinned, sliding onto a bar stool. Study break. Thought I'd grab some food. Chloe rolled her eyes, already grabbing a plate. Sit. I'll make you something. Ethan glanced around as he took a sip of water. You ever think about expanding? Chloe hesitated. Of course I have. Then why don't you? Chloe sighed, because expansion meant risk. She had worked too hard to lose it all. But the truth was, she wanted more. She wanted a second location, a bigger space, maybe even a real restaurant. But dreams cost money, and money wasn't something she had in excess. I just need to be careful, she finally said. One wrong move, and everything I built could be gone. Ethan nodded in understanding. Makes sense. She watched as he ate, her heart swelling with pride. This cafe wasn't just for her. It was for him. Everything she did was for him, for their mother, for the life they deserved. She had worked too hard to let anyone take that away. The thought made her chest tighten. She had come so far from the girl who had walked out of the rosewood in tears. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up. And if there was one thing she had learned in these years, it was this. No one would ever take away her dignity again. The rush of the day eventually slowed, and by late afternoon, Chloe finally had a moment to breathe. She stepped outside, stretching her sore muscles, and leaned against the wall, watching as people walked by. 9 years. 9 years since that night. The memory of Timothy Carter had faded over time, pushed aside by bigger battles. She rarely thought about him anymore. But fate had a cruel sense of humor, because in just a few short weeks their paths would cross again. And this time, she would be the one holding all the power. The stench of cheap disinfectant clung to the walls of the rundown motel room as Timothy sat hunched over the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees. The room was small, the carpet stained, the flickering light above casting a dim, sickly glow. This was where he had ended up. This was his new reality. He rubbed his face with both hands, the weight of his downfall pressing against his chest like a stone. The past few weeks had been a blur of humiliation, confusion, and sheer disbelief. How had it come to this just a few months ago? Few. He had everything. A company worth millions. A penthouse with a view that stretched across the city skyline. A life that most people only dreamed of. He had power, respect, influence. And now, he had nothing. Jeffrey had destroyed him. The betrayal still burned like acid in his veins. The man he had trusted more than anyone, his closest friend, had systematically drained his company dry, manipulated the board against him, and left him to take the fall for financial losses that he hadn't even caused. It was surreal. The worst part, no one had come to his aid. The so-called friends who had once lined up for invitations to his exclusive yacht parties had vanished overnight. The women who had fawned over him at high-end galas now barely acknowledged his existence. Even the employees who had once feared and respected him didn't bother returning his calls. He had no one. Timothy stood abruptly, pacing the small space. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. He needed to get out. Grabbing his coat, he stepped outside into the cold night air. The motel was in a part of the city he never would have set foot in before. Dirty streets, flickering neon signs, people who looked like life had beaten them down just one too many times. Now, he was one of them. He walked aimlessly, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes darting to the for-lease signs in the windows of once thriving businesses. He knew the cycle well. When money dried up, people disappeared. No one cared about your past success. Once you were a failure, a group of men loitered near a corner store, their hushed conversation breaking into laughter as Timothy passed. He barely spared them a glance. He didn't belong anywhere anymore. Not in the world of luxury he had once ruled, and not in the world of the struggling and forgotten. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten all day. He barely had enough money left to last another week, and food was no longer something he took for granted. Spotting a small diner, he hesitated before stepping inside. The place was nearly empty except for a few late-night customers hunched over their meals. The waitress behind the counter gave him a tired glance as he slid into a booth. "What'll it be?" she asked, chewing on a piece of gum. Timothy pulled out a few crumpled bills and counted them. "Just coffee," he muttered. The waitress smirked. "Big spender, huh?" He ignored the comment and stared blankly at the peeling linoleum tabletop. This was his life now. The waitress returned a minute later, setting a chipped mug in front of him. He took a sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. But he didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury he could no longer afford. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Timothy barely looked up, until he heard a name that made his blood run cold. "Hey, did you hear about Chloe Harper?" He froze. Two men at the counter were deep in conversation, their voices casual. "Yeah," the other replied. "She's killing it with that restaurant of hers. Chloe's Kitchen, right? Not just a kitchen anymore," the first man said, shaking his head. "I heard she's looking to expand. She went from a waitress to a business owner in just a few years. That woman worked her ass off." Timothy clenched his jaw. Chloe Harper, the last time he had seen her, she had been standing in the rosewood, a look of humiliation on her face as he had cut her down with words meant to wound. "Don't get too close. You reek of poverty." He hadn't thought about her in years, but now, hearing her name, knowing she had climbed her way up in the world while he had fallen, made his stomach twist in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. He took another sip of his coffee, his hands tightening around the cup. She had survived. No, she had thrived. And he was sitting in a cheap diner, drinking dollar store coffee, wondering how the hell his life had crumbled so fast. Timothy didn't know what fate had planned, but something told him he would be seeing Chloe Harper again. And when that moment came, he would be the one standing in her shadow. Timothy pulled his coat tighter around his body as the biting wind swept through the city streets. His once pristine designer jacket was now worn at the edges, a cruel reminder of just how far he had fallen. The past few months had been an endless cycle of disappointment, rejection, and humiliation. He had applied for jobs. Any job. It didn't matter that he had once been the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. No one wanted to hire a man who had lost everything. His name was now synonymous with failure. A part of him had considered leaving the city altogether, starting fresh somewhere far away. But pride, or maybe sheer stubbornness, kept him rooted here. He refused to believe this was how his story would end. That's how he found himself standing outside the employment agency, staring at the flickering neon sign that read, "Hiring opportunities. Inquire within." Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The place was far from glamorous. Cheap plastic chairs, peeling paint on the walls, and an overworked receptionist typing away behind the counter. The room was filled with people, most of them looking just as defeated as he felt. "Next," the receptionist called, barely glancing up. Timothy approached the desk. "Name?" she asked, her fingers still flying over the keyboard. "Timothy Carter." She finally looked up, and something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, pity, God, he hated that look. She masked it quickly and forced a polite smile. "All right, Mr. Carter. Let's see what we have available." She scrolled through the listings, her expression neutral. "With your background in business, there's a managerial position at Taken," a voice behind her muttered. She sighed. "Right, that one's already filled." "Okay, let's see. There's an opening at a logistics company. Entry-level, warehouse work." Timothy's stomach twisted. He wasn't above hard labor, but the idea of going from boardrooms to stacking boxes in a freezing warehouse was almost unbearable. The receptionist hesitated before clicking another tab on her screen. "There's one more opening. A restaurant is hiring front-of-house staff, waiters, servers, general hospitality work." Timothy exhaled slowly. A restaurant. How poetic. "Where?" he asked, his voice flat. She checked the details. A place called Chloe's Table. His heart stopped. For a moment, the noise in the room faded. replaced by the deafening roar of irony. Chloe's table. Chloe. It couldn't be. Could it? He cleared his throat, forcing his expression to remain neutral. And they're hiring. Yes, the receptionist said, eyeing him curiously. It's a well-known place. The owner started from nothing and built it into one of the most respected restaurants in the city. Apparently, she's expanding and needs more staff. Timothy barely heard the rest. His mind was stuck on 2 words. The owner. There was no way it was a coincidence. Chloe Harper. The same woman he had crushed beneath his boot years ago. The same woman whose humiliation he had laughed at without a second thought. And now he was about to walk into her restaurant, begging for a job. The irony was so brutal it almost made him laugh. Do you want to apply? The receptionist asked. Everything in him screamed no. His pride, what was left of it, begged him to walk out, to find another job, any job, where he wouldn't have to face the ghost of his past. But he didn't have choices anymore. He was broke, alone, and desperate. So, Timothy forced his lips into a tight line and nodded. Yes, I'll take it. The next day, he stood outside Chloe's table staring at the sleek glass doors. The place was impressive, elegant, modern, buzzing with the kind of energy that only success could bring. It was nothing like the Rosewood, yet it carried the same air of sophistication. Chloe had done this. She had built this. Timothy swallowed hard and stepped inside. The hostess greeted him with a professional smile. Welcome to Chloe's table. Do you have a reservation? I'm here for the interview, he said. His voice steadier than he felt. She nodded, checking the list before motioning toward the back. You can wait in the lounge area. The owner will see you shortly. Timothy sat on the plush leather chair, his hands clasped together. His heart was pounding. And then he saw her, Chloe Harper. She walked through the restaurant with the kind of quiet confidence that demanded respect. She wasn't the timid waitress he had once mocked. She was in control, poised, powerful. She didn't see him at first, too focused on speaking with the staff. But when she finally turned toward the lounge, her eyes landed on him. She froze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken history, with memories that neither had forgotten. Chloe's expression didn't shift. No shock, no anger, no satisfaction. Just cold, calculating indifference. She approached, her heels clicking against the floor. When she finally stopped in front of him, she tilted her head slightly, studying him like one might examine something they weren't sure was worth their time. Timothy Carter, she said smoothly. Well, this is unexpected. Timothy forced himself to hold her gaze. Chloe, a slow, unreadable smile curved on her lips. You're here for the waiter position. His throat felt dry. Yes. Chloe crossed her arms, considering him for a moment. Then, with a voice that was calm, professional, and laced with something he couldn't quite place, she said, All right then, let's see if you're worth hiring. And just like that, the balance of power had shifted. Timothy sat stiffly across from Chloe in her office, his back straight, hands resting on his lap, though every instinct told him to cross his arms, to shield himself from the sheer humiliation of this moment. Chloe leaned against her desk, arms crossed, watching him with a level expression that revealed nothing. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smirking in victory. She wasn't even angry. She was in control, and that somehow made this so much worse. Tell me, Timothy, she finally said, her voice smooth as glass. What exactly qualifies you for this position? He exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. I have experience managing a staff. I understand customer service, fine dining, and I know how high-end restaurants operate. Chloe hummed softly, tilting her head. Right, except you weren't exactly the serving kind. Were you? Timothy clenched his jaw. I can learn. She studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. Why are you here? He swallowed. He knew exactly what she was asking. Why, after all these years, after all the cruelty he had thrown her way, was he sitting in her restaurant, asking for a job? He could lie. He could tell her that he was simply looking for work, that it wasn't personal, that this was just another stepping stone. But they both knew the truth. He was desperate. I need the job, he admitted finally. That's it. No hidden agenda. No ulterior motive. Chloe held his gaze for another long second before nodding slowly. All right, He blinked, not expecting an answer so quickly. "All right." She pushed off her desk and moved toward the door. "Follow me." Timothy hesitated before rising to his feet, trailing behind her as they walked through the restaurant. It was late afternoon, the dining area still empty before the dinner rush. The sleek interior gleamed under soft golden lighting. Dark wood, elegant furniture, and a modern yet warm atmosphere. It was impressive. She had built this. He still couldn't wrap his head around it. They reached the staff area, where a group of employees were setting up for the night. A bartender was polishing glasses. A few waiters were arranging silverware, and a sous chef in the open kitchen was double-checking orders. "This is my team," Chloe said, gesturing to the room. "We operate like a family here. Respect is non-negotiable. I don't tolerate arrogance, mistreatment of staff, or entitlement." Timothy's throat tightened. That was meant for him. She turned to face him fully. "If you work here, you start from the bottom. You'll bus tables, clean up, take orders, no special treatment, no favors." He gave a stiff nod. "Understood." Chloe raised a brow, studying him again, as if trying to decide whether he was truly worth the risk. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, she said, "Welcome to Chloe's table, Timothy. Let's see how long you last." The uniform felt foreign on him. Timothy had never worn anything like this in his life. Black slacks, a neatly pressed white shirt, a half apron tied around his waist. It was simple, standard restaurant attire. But on him, it felt like a costume, a mockery of the life he had once lived. Still, he kept his expression neutral as he stood near the back of the restaurant, watching the other servers move effortlessly through their tasks. He was waiting for instructions. "All right, Carter," a voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Timothy turned to see Maggie, one of the senior waitresses, giving him a once-over with clear skepticism. "You ever actually worked in a restaurant before? Or is this some kind of midlife crisis?" Timothy exhaled slowly. "I've managed people before," Maggie scoffed. "Right, well, congratulations." "That's useless here." She shoved a notepad into his hands. "Rule number 1, customers first. They don't care about your problems, your past, or your bad day. You smile, you take their order, and you move fast." Timothy nodded, absorbing her words. "Rule number 2, she continued. No slacking off. If you're standing around looking lost, Chloe will eat you alive." He didn't doubt that. Maggie smirked, crossing her arms. "Think you can handle it?" Timothy met her gaze, forcing himself not to hesitate. "Yes, good." She gestured toward a few empty tables. "Start setting up." He got to work. The motions were unfamiliar, but he adapted quickly, folding napkins, arranging silverware, wiping down tables. His movements were stiff at first, his pride fighting against every menial task, but he forced himself to do it, because no matter how much this burned, he wasn't going to quit. Not yet, by the time the dinner rush hit. Timothy had barely caught his breath. The restaurant transformed. Tables filled up. Conversations buzzed in the air. The kitchen moved at lightning speed. Orders flew in. Drinks were poured. Plates were carried out. And through it all, Timothy found himself drowning in the chaos. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. At Carter Enterprises, everything had been meticulously controlled. Meetings scheduled to the second, assistants handling the logistics, people waiting on his every command. But here, no one waited for him. If he fell behind, he was in the way. By the middle of his shift, sweat was clinging to the back of his neck. His feet ached and his patience was wearing thin. Then, he made his first mistake. A customer, an older businessman, asked for a drink refill. Timothy, distracted and overwhelmed, grabbed the wrong bottle from the bar the moment the glass touched the man's lips. He grimaced, slamming it down. "This isn't what I ordered." Timothy stiffened. Are you serious?" The man's voice rose. "Do you even know what you're doing?" The familiar sting of humiliation crept into Timothy's chest. His fingers curled into a fist at his side, his old self itching to snap back. But before he could say anything, Chloe appeared. She approached the table with practiced ease, her expression calm, professional. "I apologize for the mistake, sir," she said smoothly, picking up the glass. "I'll have your drink replaced right away. Your next round is on us." The man relaxed immediately, his annoyance fading. "See, that's how you handle things." Chloe smiled, though there was something sharp in her eyes as she turned to Timothy. "Follow me," she said quietly. He didn't argue. She led him toward the back of the restaurant, stopping near the service station. Timothy braced himself for the inevitable scolding. Instead, Chloe simply met his gaze and said, "You need to decide something, Timothy." His throat was dry. "Decide what?" Her expression didn't waver. "Whether you're actually going to try, or if you're just waiting to fail." The words struck something deep inside him, and for the first time since stepping into this restaurant, he didn't have an answer. Timothy stood near the service station, Chloe's words still ringing in his ears. "You need to decide whether you're actually going to try, or if you're just waiting to fail." She had said it so plainly, without mockery, without cruelty, just cold, hard truth. And that was what stung the most, because deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent years at the top, controlling everything and everyone around him. He had dictated terms, signed deals worth millions, built a company with his name on the doors. Now he was nothing more than a rookie in a fast-paced restaurant, fumbling through tasks that should have been simple. The humiliation burned, but something else began to flicker beneath the shame. Determination. If this was his life now, then he had to stop waiting for an escape route, for the first time in months. Timothy Carter made a decision. He was going to try. He exhaled, straightened his back, and pushed forward into the chaos. The next few hours were brutal. Timothy forced himself to focus, to listen, to learn, to move. He watched how the other waiters handled their tables, how they anticipated what customers needed before they even asked. He studied Maggie's efficiency, the way she glided through the restaurant, balancing trays with an ease that made it look effortless. But nothing about this job was effortless. His body was already protesting. His feet throbbed, his lower back ached, and a dull headache pulsed at his temples. He made mistakes, plenty of them. He delivered the wrong dish to a couple on table 6. He refilled a glass of wine with the wrong bottle, earning a glare from the bartender. And at one point, he accidentally bumped into a busboy, sending a stack of plates crashing to the floor. The entire restaurant turned to stare at the commotion. And for a moment, Timothy wanted to disappear. Maggie walked by, sighing as she crouched to help him clean up. "For someone who used to run a company, you sure are bad at taking orders." Timothy clenched his jaw. "I'll get better," Maggie snorted. "I'll believe it when I see it." Still, she didn't push him aside. She didn't mock him. She just handed him another rag and kept working. For a man who had spent his entire career surrounded by sycophants, it was jarring to be treated like an equal, like just another employee trying to get through the night. He didn't know if he hated it or respected it. By the time the dinner rush ended, Timothy was running on fumes. His muscles burned from carrying heavy trays. His shirt was damp with sweat, and every nerve in his body begged him to sit down. But somehow, he had made it through. As the last customer left and the restaurant finally closed for the night, a quiet sense of relief settled over the staff. The employees gathered near the bar, some rubbing their sore shoulders, others downing glasses of water. Chloe stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, surveying the room. "Good job tonight," she said, her voice even, professional. "It was one of our busiest nights in weeks, and we handled it well." A few staff members murmured their agreement. Maggie clapped one of the new hires on the back. The energy in the air was a strange mix of exhaustion and quiet victory. Then Chloe's eyes landed on Timothy. "And you," she said, tilting her head slightly, "surprised me." Timothy stiffened. He hadn't expected acknowledgement, much less anything resembling approval. "You didn't quit," she continued, "even when it was obvious you wanted to." Timothy exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the bar for balance. "I told you. I need the job." Chloe studied him for another long moment before nodding. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be just as busy." With that, she pushed off the counter and disappeared into her office. Timothy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maggie smirked beside him. "Not bad, Carter. You didn't completely crash and burn." Timothy let out a tired chuckle. "High praise," Maggie shrugged. "Gotta start somewhere." He wasn't sure why, but the words stuck with him. Maybe because for the first time in a long time, He had actually started something. Timothy barely made it back to his motel room before exhaustion dragged him under. The second he stepped inside, he kicked off his shoes, collapsed onto the bed, and let his body sink into the mattress. His entire existence ached. His feet, his back, his shoulders, his pride. But despite it all, something about tonight felt different. For the first time in months, he had done something real, something that wasn't about power plays or wealth or manipulation. It had been grueling, humiliating, and exhausting, and yet, he had survived it. He rolled onto his back, staring at the cracked ceiling, and tried to process the last 12 hours. Would he go back tomorrow? Before? The answer would have been no. But now, he wasn't so sure, because even though every inch of him was sore, even though he had messed up more times than he could count, he wasn't ready to give up. Maybe, just maybe, he could still climb his way back up, not to his old life. That version of him was gone, but to something else, something better. Timothy closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another battle, but for once he wasn't dreading it. Timothy's body ached in places he never thought possible. The moment his alarm blared the next morning, he considered ignoring it. Just 5 more minutes, maybe 10. But the sharp memory of last night, of Chloe's words and the quiet challenge in her eyes, pushed him out of bed. He groaned as he stretched, his muscles screaming in protest. How did people do this every day? He had spent years sitting behind a mahogany desk, giving orders, making million-dollar decisions, controlling the fate of others with the stroke of a pen, and now he was about to spend another night bussing tables and scrubbing plates. The old Timothy would have walked away. The new Timothy had no choice. By the time he arrived at Chloe's table, the restaurant was already alive with movement. Servers prepared for the upcoming dinner rush. Chefs barked orders in the kitchen, and Maggie was setting up the bar, her usual smirk in place when she saw him. "Look who actually came back," she teased, tossing him a notepad. "Guess you survived your first night after all." Timothy rolled his shoulders, wincing. "Barely." Maggie laughed. "Yeah, you look like someone ran you over with a truck." Timothy ignored her and focused on the tasks ahead. His first goal of the night: no mistakes. He refused to be the weak link in this place. He wiped down tables, double-checked orders before sending them out, and forced himself to pay attention to the way the others worked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was work. And for the first time in a long time, he was earning his keep. But then, the universe decided to remind him exactly who he used to be. Halfway through his shift, a familiar voice sliced through the air. "No way! Is that Timothy Carter?" Timothy froze, recognizing the voice instantly. At a corner table sat Richard Langford, a former business associate, along with 2 other men who had once praised him in boardrooms and toasted champagne to his success. And now they were here, at Chloe's restaurant, watching him wear a waiter's uniform. Richard leaned back in his chair, an amused smirk tugging at his lips. "Jesus, didn't think I'd ever see you like this." Timothy's grip tightened around his notepad, his stomach twisting. This was his nightmare. Richard didn't stop there. "Man, life really did a number on you, huh?" He chuckled, nudging the man beside him. "From penthouses to pouring drinks, that's gotta sting." Timothy felt the eyes of the restaurant on him. A part of him, the old him, wanted to snap back, to remind Richard that he had once signed his paychecks, that he had once owned the rooms Richard begged to enter. But what would that accomplish? He wasn't that man anymore. So, instead of taking the bait, he forced his voice to remain even. "Can I get you anything?" Richard blinked, as if confused by the lack of reaction. Wow, no comeback. The Timothy Carter I knew would have flipped this table by now. Timothy kept his expression neutral. "Would you like to order or not?" The men exchanged glances, laughing under their breath. "Sure," Richard said, still smirking. "Scotch neat, and don't screw it up, Carter." Timothy nodded, walking toward the bar. Maggie was waiting, arms crossed. "You okay?" He exhaled slowly. "I'm fine." Maggie gave him a look. "Doesn't sound like it." Timothy didn't answer. He grabbed the bottle of scotch, poured the drink perfectly, and carried it back to the table. Setting it down without a word, Richard raised his glass. "To fallen kings." Timothy turned on his heel and walked away the moment he stepped into the back area. He gripped the counter, his knuckles white, It shouldn't bother him. He knew what people thought of him. He knew what they said behind his back. Timothy Carter had it all and lost everything, but he was still standing, and that had to count for something. By the time the shift ended, Timothy was exhausted, physically and mentally. The restaurant had cleared out, and the staff lingered near the bar, exchanging stories from the night. Timothy sat on a stool, rubbing his temples. A glass of water slid in front of him. He looked up to see Chloe standing there, watching him carefully. "You didn't punch him," she noted. Timothy huffed a dry laugh. "Wouldn't have done me any good." Chloe leaned against the counter, studying him. "You handled it well." Timothy glanced at her. "Were you watching?" Her lips curved slightly. "I watch everything that happens in my restaurant." There was no mockery in her tone, just quiet observation. Timothy picked up the glass and took a sip. "They're right, though, I did fall." Chloe tilted her head. "And yet, you're here." Timothy exhaled. "I don't know why." Chloe's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe you do." He didn't respond, because maybe he did. Maybe a part of him wasn't here just for survival. Maybe a part of him wanted to prove, to himself, to Chloe, to everyone, that he was more than his past. Chloe straightened. "Go home, Carter. Get some sleep. You have work tomorrow." Timothy watched her walk away, something strange settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his past failures. He was thinking about what came next. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to find out. Timothy walked into Chloe's table the next evening with something unfamiliar sitting in his chest. Purpose. It was strange, this feeling. For so long, he had drifted through life as if waiting for something to rescue him. First, it had been money, then power, then revenge against Jeffrey. And when none of those things came, he had resigned himself to nothingness. But now, for the first time in years, he was waking up each day with an actual goal. No, it wasn't reclaiming his empire. It wasn't about proving himself to Richard, Jeffrey, or anyone else who had left him behind. It was about proving something to himself, that he could rebuild, that he wasn't just a failure, he was going to be better. And that started here. The first 2 hours of his shift went smoothly. No major mistakes, no broken glasses, no misplaced orders. Maggie even gave him a nod of approval when he successfully navigated a complicated request from a particularly demanding couple. And then came the real test. At precisely 8:30 p.m., Chloe approached him with her usual unreadable expression. "Come with me," she said simply. Timothy hesitated but followed her into the kitchen, where the heat of the stoves and the sharp scent of spices filled the air. The head chef, Marco, was plating a dish with the precision of an artist. Chloe gestured to the organized chaos around them. "You've been working front of house, but if you're serious about learning, you need to understand what happens back here too." Timothy frowned. "I'm not a chef." "You don't have to be," Chloe said. "But every good restaurant owner knows their kitchen as well as their dining room." "You wanted a second chance, didn't you?" Timothy hated that she always seemed to know exactly where to push. He sighed and nodded. "All right, show me." Chloe didn't smile, but there was something like approval in her eyes. "Marco, put him to work," she said before stepping aside. The chef turned, looking Timothy up and down. "You ever handle food before?" Timothy almost laughed. The closest he had ever come to cooking was deciding which five-star restaurant to order from. "No," he admitted. Marco grunted. "Figured. All right, start with the basics. Peel these potatoes." Timothy blinked. "That's it," Marco smirked. "You think it's easy? Go ahead." Timothy grabbed a peeler and started. Within 10 minutes, he had cut his finger twice and was already sweating. Marco shook his head. "Jesus, you hold a knife like someone who's never worked a day in his life," Timothy scowled. "I have worked. Just not like this." Marco rolled his eyes. Yeah. Billionaire to busboy. I know the story. Look, if you want to survive in this place, drop the ego. The kitchen doesn't care who you used to be." Timothy tightened his grip on the peeler. Drop the ego. That was the hardest part. For years, his ego had been his armor. It had been what separated him from the weak, from the poor, from the people he thought were beneath him. And now, he was one of them. Timothy exhaled slowly. "Fine, teach me." Marco nodded once. Good. Now start over and try not to slice your damn finger this time. By the end of the night, Timothy had learned exactly how much he didn't know. His hands were sore from chopping, his arms ached from carrying trays of ingredients. His entire body felt like it had been through a war zone. But something strange happened. When Marco handed him a plate of perfectly seared steak and roasted potatoes, Timothy felt a flicker of pride. "You helped make this," Marco said simply. Timothy frowned. "I just peeled the potatoes." Marco shrugged. "Still counts. It all matters." Timothy stared at the plate for a moment. It all matters. It was such a foreign concept to him. For years, he had only valued the big things: money, power, dominance. But now, standing in the heat of a kitchen, he was realizing that maybe the small things mattered too. After the last customer left and the staff finished cleaning, Timothy stepped out into the cool night air, stretching his sore muscles. "You survived another night," a voice said behind him. He turned to see Chloe, arms crossed, watching him carefully. He smirked. "You sound almost disappointed." Chloe didn't smile, but there was something lighter in her gaze. "Not yet, but I will be if you start slacking." Timothy let out a breath. "I'm not going to." For a long moment, Chloe studied him. "You're different," she finally said. He stilled. "Than before?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah, than before." Timothy wasn't sure what to say to that. But for the first time since stepping into this restaurant, he didn't feel like a fraud. He was working, learning, changing, and maybe, just maybe, Chloe was starting to see it too. Timothy's muscles burned with exhaustion, but he kept moving. The restaurant was packed, every table filled, waiters weaving through the crowd like a well-rehearsed dance. The air buzzed with conversation, silverware clinking against plates, and the distant sizzle of steaks on the grill. Timothy had learned just enough over the past few weeks to keep up. He still made mistakes, but fewer now. His hands were steadier, his movements quicker. He no longer questioned whether he could carry 3 plates at once. He just did it. And yet, tonight was different. There was an edge in the air. A tension among the staff that hadn't been there before. Chloe had been on high alert all evening, speaking in hushed tones with Maggie and Marco. Timothy didn't know why, but something was off, and he was about to find out. The first real problem of the night came at table 7, a man in a tailored navy suit. Clearly wealthy, sat with a woman draped in designer clothing. Timothy approached with his notepad, offering a professional smile. "Good evening. Can I get you started with something to drink?" The man barely glanced at him, scrolling through his phone. "Whiskey, neat?" The woman sighed. "I'll have a Chardonnay." Timothy nodded, making a quick note. "Of course, and for dinner?" The man finally looked up, his gaze settling on Timothy, his brows furrowed. A slow, mocking smirk curved his lips. "Wait, hold on," he said, sitting back. "I know you." Timothy's stomach tightened. Not again. Timothy Carter, right. The man let out a low chuckle. "Holy hell! I thought it was a joke when I heard you were working as a waiter." Timothy didn't move, didn't flinch, but inside, the humiliation threatened to crawl up his throat. The woman leaned forward, intrigued. "Who is he?" The man grinned. "Used to be one of the richest men in the city, had a company, a mansion, everything. Then he lost it all." The woman's eyes widened. "Oh, yeah," the man said, shaking his head. "And now, he's serving me dinner." Timothy forced his voice to remain even. "Would you like to order now, sir?" The man laughed. "Damn, you really are desperate." Timothy's fingernails dug into his palm. But he didn't snap, because this was exactly what Chloe had meant. This was the moment where the old him would have lashed out, thrown his apron on the ground, and stormed out. But he wasn't that man anymore. So instead, he met the man's eyes, calm and controlled. "Would you like to order now?" "Sir?" he repeated. Something in the man's smirk flickered. He had expected a reaction. Anger, embarrassment, anything. But Timothy didn't give him the satisfaction. The man scoffed, waving a hand. "Yeah, fine. Filet mignon, medium rare." The woman glanced at Timothy hesitantly. "The salmon, please." Timothy nodded. "Coming right up." And with that, he walked away. Chloe was watching when he returned to the service station. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You handled that well. Timothy let out a slow breath. Did I? She smirked. You didn't break a plate over his head, so I'd say yes. Timothy let out a tired chuckle. Tempting, but no. Chloe studied him for a moment before nodding. Good. She started to walk away, but Timothy called after her. What's going on tonight? He asked. Everyone seems on edge. Chloe hesitated. Then she exhaled and looked back at him. There's a critic here, she admitted. Timothy's brows lifted. That explained a lot. Food critics were a big deal. A single bad review could wreck a restaurant's reputation. Where? He asked, scanning the room. Chloe tilted her head toward the corner booth. Table 12. Timothy followed her gaze. Seated at the back of the restaurant was an older man with sharp eyes and a notebook. Casually observing every single plate that passed by, Timothy understood now. This wasn't just a busy night. This was a test, and they couldn't afford to fail. The night wore on, the tension never fully leaving the air. Timothy focused harder than ever before, double-checking orders, making sure every plate was perfect before sending it out, reading customers' moods with precision. Every time he passed table 12, his pulse quickened, waiting for a reaction from the critic. Would he frown, scribble something bad? But so far, the man remained unreadable. And then, just as things seemed to be going smoothly, disaster struck. A plate slipped. It wasn't Timothy's fault. One of the newer servers lost their grip, sending a dish crashing onto the floor. Right next to the critic's table, the restaurant went dead silent. The server stood frozen, horror etched onto her face. Timothy reacted instantly, before the moment could spiral into disaster. He stepped forward, picking up the broken plate with practiced ease. I sincerely apologize for the accident, he said smoothly, his voice calm, controlled. Let me get that replaced immediately. The critic eyed him, then nodded once. Timothy turned to the trembling server and offered her a quick, reassuring nod. This wasn't the end of the world. Accidents happened. It was about how you recovered, and so within minutes the mess was cleaned. The plate was replaced, and the night moved on. But something shifted in the critic's demeanor. He was watching Timothy now, his pen tapping against the edge of his notebook. And Timothy had a feeling that it wasn't a bad thing. By the time the restaurant finally closed, Timothy was dead on his feet. The staff collapsed onto chairs, sighing in relief. Maggie whistled. That was brutal. Chloe stepped forward, glancing around the group. You all did well tonight. There was a collective murmur of tired appreciation. Then her eyes landed on Timothy. You in particular, she said. You handled yourself better than I expected. Timothy arched a brow. You had low expectations. Chloe smirked. Very. He chuckled, shaking his head. But deep down, he felt something different for the first time since everything fell apart. He wasn't just surviving. He was earning his place. And somehow, that meant more than all the money he had ever had. Timothy's body ached, but the exhaustion was different tonight. It wasn't just the physical toll of carrying trays, wiping down tables, or navigating through the dinner rush. It was mental. Emotional? The critic had left without a word, but everyone felt it. Now, as the staff wound down for the night, a sense of restlessness filled the air. The kitchen was quiet, the dining room empty, yet no one truly relaxed. Maggie leaned against the bar, rubbing her temples. That was hell. Marco, the head chef, grunted in agreement. If he gives us a bad review, we're screwed. Timothy, drying off a glass behind the counter, remained silent. He had learned a lot since stepping into Chloe's table, but tonight had taught him something new. The weight of reputation. At Carter Enterprises, a bad investment could be corrected. A failed deal could be negotiated, but in the restaurant world, one bad night, one bad critic, one bad review, and everything could collapse. The waiting game. Chloe finally emerged from her office, her calm mask firmly in place. No one spoke as she approached. They were all waiting. She exhaled. I just got word. A heavy pause. Then, he wrote a preliminary review. It'll go live tomorrow. A collective inhale filled the room. Is it bad? Marco asked, voice tight. Chloe hesitated, then, slowly, she smiled. A real, genuine, relieved smile. It's good, she said. The tension snapped. Maggie practically collapsed onto the bar. Marco muttered something in Italian, shaking his head in gratitude. Some of the staff actually cheered. Timothy, for the first time in his life, saw what true pride in hard work looked like. And strangely, he felt it too. Chloe unfolded a piece of paper and read aloud. Chloe's table offers a refined yet welcoming dining experience, one that speaks of passion and perseverance. The food is crafted with care, the service is attentive yet unintrusive, and the atmosphere blends elegance with comfort. But what stands out most is the resilience in its foundation. The restaurant, much like its owner, carries a quiet strength, an unwavering dedication to proving that success is not just measured in wealth, but in the people who build it. A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the staff. Maggie wiped fake tears from her eyes. "Damn, that's poetic," Marco snorted. "That critic should write novels." Timothy, however, caught something deeper in Chloe's expression. That last line, "Success is not just measured in wealth, but in the people who build it." It wasn't just a compliment. It was a reminder, and it was one she understood better than anyone. The conversation that changed everything later that night. As the restaurant finally emptied, Timothy found himself alone in the dining area, wiping down the last of the tables. The quiet felt different tonight. Not eerie, not empty, but earned. He heard the familiar click of heels behind him. "You're still here." Timothy glanced over his shoulder. Chloe stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching him. "Figured I'd help close up," he said simply. Chloe leaned against the nearest chair, studying him. "You don't have to." Timothy shrugged. "I know." A long beat of silence stretched between them. Then, "You handled tonight well," Chloe said. Timothy wiped down the last table, tossing the rag aside. "I just did my job." "That's not what I meant," she said. He turned to face her fully. "You didn't let that guy get to you," Chloe continued. "Richard, or the critic. The old you wouldn't have handled that well." Timothy let out a quiet chuckle. "The old me wouldn't have been here in the first place." Chloe tilted her head slightly. "So, why are you still here?" The question lingered between them. Timothy could have answered with 1,000 different excuses. Because he needed money. Because he had nowhere else to go. Because he had no choice. But that wasn't the truth anymore, was it? He looked around the empty restaurant. The dimmed lights. The polished wood floors. The lingering scent of wine and freshly baked bread. And for the first time, he realized, this place had become something more than just a job. It had become a challenge, a lesson, a lifeline. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning, growing, changing, and maybe, just maybe, that was worth staying for. So instead of answering, he just said, "See you tomorrow, Chloe." And for the first time, she didn't look surprised to hear it. She simply nodded, and for the first time since losing everything, Timothy felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Timothy had experienced chaos before. He had seen markets crash, watched investors panic, witnessed entire corporations crumble under the weight of their own greed. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the madness of Chloe's table the day after the review was published. The phone never stopped ringing. The reservation book filled up faster than the hostess could write down names. Customers arrived in droves, some willing to wait hours just for a table. The kitchen was a war zone, the dining area a whirlwind of movement. And yet, through it all, Chloe stood unshaken. She moved through the restaurant like a commander on a battlefield, giving orders, checking on guests, helping the overwhelmed waitstaff when necessary. If she felt even a fraction of the pressure weighing on her shoulders, she didn't show it. Timothy, on the other hand, was barely keeping up. He had worked busy nights before, but this was on another level. The moment he set down one plate, another table was calling for him. If he turned around for even a second, Maggie was already shoving another order into his hands. By the time the dinner rush finally began to slow, his entire body ached, and his shirt clung uncomfortably to his skin. He could barely think, let alone move. And yet, he felt something strange, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Satisfaction, not the kind that came from money or power, but something simpler. The feeling of earning something, the knowledge that he had done something real, something tangible. He had never respected this kind of work before, but tonight, as he wiped his forehead and exhaled deeply, he finally understood it. Near the end of the shift, something strange happened. Timothy was making his way toward the bar when he saw Chloe speaking with a man he didn't recognize. The man was tall, sharply dressed, exuding the kind of casual arrogance Timothy had once worn so easily. Even from across the room, he could see the tension in Chloe's posture. Then, the man slid a business card across the counter. Chloe barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward him, shaking her head. Timothy didn't know why, but something about that exchange bothered him. The man smirked, said something else, and then casually walked out. Timothy hesitated before approaching Chloe. "Everything all right?" he asked. Chloe let out a short breath, running a hand through her hair. "Developers want to buy the building." Timothy felt a flicker of unease. She leaned against the counter, shaking her head. "They want to tear it down and put up a high-rise luxury condos, more overpriced real estate for the city's elite." Timothy exhaled, leaning beside her. "And you told them to go to hell." Chloe smirked, but there was something else behind it. Something heavy. Not in those exact words, she admitted, but close enough. Timothy studied her carefully. "You're not actually considering it, are you?" Chloe's smirk faded. Not for a second. That should have reassured him. But something about the way she said it, so firm, so absolute, made him realize how much this place truly meant to her. Chloe's table wasn't just a business. It was her proof. Proof that she had built something on her own. Proof that she had survived. Proof that she didn't need people like Timothy Carter to succeed. And yet, here he was, standing beside her, invested in a way he never expected. "This place means a lot to you," he said quietly. Chloe turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "Yeah," she murmured. "It does." Timothy had nothing to say to that, because for the first time, he understood it. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when this place had become more than just a job to him, but it had. And that realization was almost as terrifying as losing everything had been. By the time the restaurant finally emptied, Timothy was physically drained, but his mind wouldn't stop spinning as he wiped down the last few tables. Chloe approached again, arms crossed, studying him in that way that always made him feel like she could see right through him. "You didn't have to stay this late," she said. Timothy smirked slightly. "Neither did you." Chloe rolled her eyes but didn't argue. For a moment, they just stood there in comfortable silence. Then, after a beat, Chloe said, "You handled today well." Timothy raised an eyebrow. "Is that an actual compliment?" Chloe sighed. "Don't get used to it." Timothy chuckled, shaking his head. But deep down it mattered, more than it should have, as he grabbed his coat and headed toward the door. Chloe called after him. "You'll be back tomorrow." Timothy turned, meeting her gaze. Something unspoken passed between them. Something neither of them wanted to name yet. "Yeah," he said simply. "I will." And this time, she didn't look surprised to hear it. Timothy arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. The night before had left him restless, his mind tangled in thoughts he wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. Something about that conversation with Chloe, about the developers, about what this place meant to her, had stuck with him. He didn't just admire Chloe's resolve, he respected it. And that was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. When he walked inside, the restaurant was quieter than usual, the hum of early preparations already in motion. Marco and the kitchen staff were going through their prep work. Maggie was setting up the bar, and Chloe was standing at the front, flipping through a clipboard. She glanced up when she saw him, "You're early," she said. Timothy shrugged. "Figured I'd get a head start." Chloe arched a brow. "That's surprising." "Don't get used to it," he smirked. But there was no bite behind his words. Chloe didn't press further, but he could tell she was watching him, trying to understand why he was still here. He wasn't entirely sure himself. The night started smoothly, the kind of busy they were used to now. Customers filled the restaurant. Orders flowed seamlessly, and the staff moved in rhythm. Timothy was more comfortable now. He didn't hesitate when approaching tables, didn't second-guess himself when taking orders. He wasn't perfect, but he was competent. He was good. And then, at the worst possible moment, he saw him. Jeffrey, his former business partner, the man who had stolen everything from him. He was sitting at a table near the back, casually sipping a glass of whiskey, looking as polished and untouchable as ever. Timothy's blood ran cold. For a moment, the world blurred around him, his grip tightening on the tray in his hands. Jeffrey shouldn't be here. He had avoided running into him since his fall from grace. The idea of facing him like this, dressed as a waiter, working for a woman he had once humiliated, felt like a cruel joke. And judging by the amused smirk playing on Jeffrey's lips, he knew exactly what he was doing. "Well, well," Jeffrey said as Timothy approached, his voice dripping with mockery. "I almost didn't recognize you in that uniform. A little different from the $1,000 suits, isn't it?" Timothy's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" Jeffrey took a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down. "I just wanted to see it for myself. The great Timothy Carter, reduced to this." He gestured around the restaurant with a lazy flick of his wrist. "Tell me, how does it feel to serve people like me?" Timothy's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the weight of every decision that had brought him here, the sharp contrast between his old life and his new reality. But he didn't react. Not like he once would have. Instead, he forced his voice to stay calm. "If you're here to eat, order something. If not, leave." Jeffrey let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "You're really playing the part, huh?" Timothy said nothing. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Jeffrey leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You know, I always thought you were the smartest guy in the room, but it turns out you were just another fool who thought loyalty meant something." Timothy's fingers curled around the tray, his knuckles white. He didn't need to be reminded of that. "I bet you hate me," Jeffrey continued, smirking. "But deep down, you know this was always going to happen. You were too arrogant to see it coming." Timothy exhaled slowly. Years ago, this conversation would have ended with him throwing a punch. Now, he just felt tired. "You're right," he said finally. "I didn't see it coming, but I see things a lot clearer now." Jeffrey's smirk faltered just a little. "And what exactly do you see?" Timothy straightened. "That you can sit here, sipping your expensive whiskey, laughing at me all you want. But at the end of the day, I'm still standing." Jeffrey's eyes narrowed slightly. "You took everything from me," Timothy continued, his voice steady. "And yet, here I am. I lost everything, and I'm still here. And you know what? I don't need to be you anymore." Jeffrey tilted his head, amusement flickering behind his gaze. "Is that so?" Timothy nodded. "Yeah, and I think deep down you hate that." There was a beat of silence. For the first time, Jeffrey didn't have a quick retort. That, in itself, felt like a victory. Without another word, Timothy turned and walked away. And this time, it didn't feel like retreating. It felt like winning. Chloe was waiting for him near the kitchen when he returned. Arms crossed. "You okay?" she asked. Timothy let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Chloe didn't look convinced. "What did he say?" Timothy met her gaze. "Does it matter?" She studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "No," she said. "I guess it doesn't." And just like that, the night went on. For the first time, Timothy felt free. Timothy didn't sleep that night, even after leaving the restaurant, even after walking the long way back to his small apartment, even after collapsing onto his bed. The encounter with Jeffrey played over and over in his mind. The smirk, the condescension, the satisfaction in his voice. But for the first time, Timothy didn't feel defeated. He had faced Jeffrey without letting anger consume him. He had walked away on his own terms. And yet, a question lingered in the back of his mind, one he couldn't shake. What now? For months, he had been surviving, pushing forward one shift at a time. But after that conversation, after proving to himself that he wasn't the same man who had been ruined, he realized something. Survival wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more, but more of what? As the city lights flickered outside his window, he had no answer. The next evening at Chloe's table, things were back to normal, or at least they should have been, but Timothy felt different. The restaurant no longer felt like just a place to work. It felt like a choice, and that was dangerous, because choices led to attachments, and attachments could be taken away. He was in the middle of setting up a table when Chloe approached, her expression unreadable. "You okay?" Timothy glanced up, startled. "Why?" She shrugged. "You're quieter than usual." Timothy hesitated, then set down the last glass. "I was just thinking, that's dangerous," Chloe deadpanned. A small smirk tugged at his lips. "No kidding." Chloe leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Was it about Jeffrey?" Timothy exhaled. rubbing a hand over his face. Not exactly, it was more about everything else. Chloe tilted her head slightly. Meaning? Timothy hesitated before finally saying it. I've spent my whole life thinking power and money were the only things that mattered, he admitted. And then, when I lost them, I thought nothing mattered. He let out a dry chuckle. Turns out, I was wrong about both. Chloe watched him carefully, waiting. Timothy exhaled. I don't want to just exist anymore. I want to build something again. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. He hadn't even realized it until now. But it was true. For the first time since his fall, he wanted to create something of his own again. Chloe studied him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Then she simply said, Good. Timothy blinked. Good. She nodded. It's about time. He let out a soft laugh. You're really not surprised by anything anymore, are you? Chloe smirked. Nope. For a second, they just stood there. The restaurant hummed around them, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then Chloe pushed off the table. Come on, Carter, we've got customers. Timothy nodded, following her, and this time, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't lost. He was exactly where he needed to be. The dinner rush was relentless. The critics' review had worked its magic. Every table was full, the staff moving at full speed, the kitchen working overtime. Timothy barely had a second to breathe, but he didn't mind. He had a goal now. He wasn't just working for a paycheck. He was learning, studying the way Chloe ran things, the way she handled the staff, the way she made every single person in this restaurant feel like they mattered. And that's when it hit him. It wasn't just about owning something again. It was about building something real, not just power for the sake of power, not just success for the sake of his ego, something that meant something. And that realization scared him more than anything, because if he truly wanted that, then that meant letting go of his past, for good, by the time the shift ended. Timothy was exhausted but energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. The staff began closing up, wiping down tables, stacking chairs. Chloe was in her office, finishing the nightly numbers. Timothy found himself standing behind the bar, wiping down a glass absent-mindedly. Maggie plopped onto the stool across from him, watching him closely. You're different, she said. Timothy arched a brow. I showered today. Maggie rolled her eyes. No, dumbass. I mean you. The way you've been working. The way you handle things. You actually care now. Timothy didn't answer right away, because for the first time he couldn't deny it. Yeah, he admitted finally. I do. Maggie smirked. Took you long enough. Timothy huffed a small laugh, shaking his head. Yeah. Get out of here before I make you do more work. Maggie grinned but stood, stretching. See you tomorrow, Carter. As she walked away, Timothy glanced toward Chloe's office. He didn't know what was next. Didn't know how much longer he'd be here. But one thing was clear. He wasn't done yet. And that was enough. For now, Timothy never thought he'd wake up one morning and want to go to work. But here he was. There was no hesitation as he got up. No lingering weight of regret holding him down. He showered, dressed, and walked out the door, feeling something he hadn't in years. Clarity. For the first time, he knew what he wanted, and today, he was going to do something about it. When he stepped into Chloe's table, the restaurant was alive with the familiar sounds of preparation, the rhythmic chopping from the kitchen, the quiet hum of conversation between staff members, the clinking of silverware as tables were set. But today, it felt different. This wasn't just another shift. This was the moment he had been building toward. Without even realizing it, Timothy spotted Chloe at the front, going over the schedule. He took a deep breath and walked toward her. Got a second? Chloe glanced up, slightly surprised by the seriousness in his tone. What's up? Timothy exhaled. I want in. Chloe frowned. In. I want to be more than just a waiter, he said, his voice steady. I want to be part of this. Chloe studied him, skepticism flickering in her eyes. Why? She asked. Timothy didn't hesitate. Because this place matters. Because you built something real. And because for the first time in my life, I actually give a damn about something other than myself. Chloe arched a brow. That's a dangerous confession, Carter. He smirked. Guess I'm a changed man. Chloe didn't reply immediately. Instead, she leaned against the counter, watching him with the same sharp intuition she always had. "You really think you can handle this?" Timothy met her gaze. "Try me." Another beat of silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she smirked. "Fine," she said, "but you're starting at the bottom." Timothy chuckled. "Wouldn't expect anything else." Chloe nodded. "Good. Now get to work." And just like that, everything changed. The next few weeks were some of the hardest of Timothy's life. Chloe didn't go easy on him. She made him learn everything: how to handle inventory, how to negotiate with vendors, how to manage finances, how to deal with customer complaints. She tested him at every turn, looking for any sign of hesitation, any indication that he wasn't truly committed. But he never backed down, because this time, failure wasn't an option. This wasn't just a temporary job anymore. This was his future, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. One evening, long after closing, Timothy sat at the bar, a notepad in front of him. He was going over numbers, cross-referencing supply orders, learning the financial side of the restaurant. Chloe walked over, her own coffee cup in hand. She glanced at the papers in front of him. "You really are serious about this," she mused. Timothy looked up. "Told you I was." She sipped her coffee, considering Tim and most people would have walked away by now. Timothy leaned back, stretching his shoulders. "Most people aren't me," Chloe smirked. "That's for damn sure." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Chloe said something he didn't expect. "I never thought you'd change." Timothy met her gaze. "Neither did I." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "But you did." Timothy swallowed, something tightening in his chest. Because coming from Chloe, that meant something. He cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "So, does this mean you're finally admitting I'm good at this?" Chloe rolled her eyes. "Don't push your luck, Carter." Timothy chuckled, shaking his head. But deep down, he knew this place had become his home. And for the first time in his life, he didn't need anything else. A few weeks later, Timothy found himself in Chloe's office, staring at a contract, a partnership agreement, a real stake in Chloe's table. He looked up at her, searching for any trace of hesitation. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Chloe crossed her arms. "Are you?" Timothy didn't hesitate. He picked up the pen and signed his name. And just like that, he wasn't just an employee anymore. He was part of something real, something worth fighting for, something worth staying for. As he set the pen down, Chloe smirked. "Welcome to the family, Carter." Timothy exhaled, a slow, satisfied smile forming on his lips. "Feels good to be home." And for the first time in a long, long time, it finally was.